Canada has more than 1,000 ghost towns on record. For most of them, there's an official reason. A mine that closed. A railway that changed course. A flood. Something documented, filed, archived. Something you can look up. But there are 11 towns for which the official reason arrived late. After a death, after a file was closed, after a silence that lasted decades longer than it should have. This isn't a video about ghost towns. It's about what happens when a death precedes an emptying, and the records about that emptying are sealed before any public conclusion is reached. It's about a pattern, recognizable, repeatable, and troubling enough that calling it coincidence stopped feeling honest a long time ago. The RCMP has never officially addressed what connects these 11 places. Maybe that's the point. Each city in this countdown is empty not simply because the economy shifted or the resource ran dry. It's empty because something happened. Someone died. And the Canadian state decided, deliberately, that the case didn't require a public answer. The physical abandonment of these towns is the mirror image of the legal abandonment of the people who lived in them. We're going to look at both. There's a hiking trail now. That's what's left. Bankhead sits, or rather, sat, in the shadow of Cascade Mountain just outside Banff. In the early 1900s, it was a functioning coal town built and operated by the Canadian Pacific Railway. Miners' houses, a church, a school, snow on the rooftops in winter, smoke from the chimneys, children walking to class in the cold. At its peak, over 1,000 people lived there. What most visitors walking that trail don't know is that Bankhead didn't just fade out economically. It was dissolved, formally, deliberately, by the CPR in 1922, following a series of deaths connected to labor disputes and strike actions that had turned increasingly confrontational in the years prior. The RCMP files on those confrontations were closed under the classification of civil disturbance resolved. No separate investigation into the deaths was ever conducted. The miners who were killed during strikes were not, apparently, the kind of detail that warranted its own file. The CPR demolished most of the town shortly after. What remained was absorbed into Banff National Park. The official interpretation is tidy, an industrial town that outlived its usefulness. The trail signs mention the coal. They don't mention the strikes. They certainly don't mention the dead. There's something almost surgical about it. The landscape was preserved. The memory inside it wasn't. Anishinaabe was a company town in the truest sense, carved out of the wilderness along the Portland Canal in northern BC by the Granby Consolidated Mining Company. At its height, more than 2,500 people lived there. It had a theater, a hospital, a hockey rink. People were born there. People expected to grow old there. In 1935, fire swept through the town. Large sections of the infrastructure burned. The number of people who died in that fire was never publicly confirmed. Think about that for a moment. A fire in a town of 2,500 people. And the official count of fatalities was simply not released. The company classified the event as an industrial accident and closed operations within weeks. Survivors were scattered. No formal resettlement process. No coordinated support. People just dispersed. What was left of Anishinaabe was abandoned to the forest. The buildings rotted. The trees came back. If you visit today, and almost no one does, you find foundations and silence. The RCMP's role in any investigation into the fire's casualties was never publicly documented, which isn't the same as saying there was no investigation. It might just mean the investigation produced findings that were more convenient to keep internal. Anishinaabe doesn't ask you to be alarmed, it just asks you to notice what's missing. Built to fuel the Cold War. That's not an exaggeration. Uranium City existed specifically to sustain the extraction of uranium for the nuclear programs of Canada and its allies. At its peak in the 1950s and 60s, around 5,000 people lived there. It had the feel of a boomtown, the purpose of a military installation, and the secrecy that came with both. Eldorado Nuclear, the Crown Corporation running operations, shut things down abruptly in 1982. In the months leading up to that closure, 2 workers died. Both deaths were classified as workplace accidents. Both files were closed. What's harder to find out is what those workers were actually doing when they died, because the radiological safety records for Uranium City were transferred to federal custody after the closure and have never been released in their entirety to the public. This matters, not just because workers died. Workplace deaths happen, and some of them genuinely are accidents. What matters here is the combination: 2 deaths in the final months, closure within a year, and the safety documentation that might contextualize those deaths locked away in a federal archive that doesn't answer information requests in full. The town still exists, technically. A few dozen people remain. But the records of what happened inside it, the records that would allow someone to ask informed questions about those 2 men, are not available for you to read. Quetzal is one of the strangest things you'll find in a Canadian atlas. A fully intact ghost town, not ruins, not foundations. An actual town, with houses and roads, and a community center, all preserved, all empty. It was built from scratch in 1979 by AMAX of Canada for molybdenum mining, completed at enormous expense, and then abandoned 18 months later when global molybdenum prices collapsed. That's the official explanation. What the official explanation doesn't feature prominently is that a senior manager died in Quetzal in the months before the closure. The company classified the death as a personal accident. The RCMP closed the file in 73 days. 73 days is fast. For a death in a remote mining town with a small, tight-knit community, a death that would have been witnessed and discussed and wondered about, 73 days is very fast. Decades later, Quetzal was purchased in its entirety by a private buyer. It remains closed to the public. You can't visit. You can't walk through it. Whatever it holds privately. There's something about a frozen town. Everything still in place, doors still on hinges, a swimming pool still there, that makes the silence feel less like absence and more like decision. Cassiar is gone. Not abandoned, gone. After the asbestos mining operation closed in 1992, the town was physically demolished, buildings taken down, infrastructure removed. The site was cleared in a way that goes beyond normal post-industrial winding down. What makes Cassiar notable and deeply uncomfortable is what was happening there before the closure. Through the 1980s, workers began dying of mesothelioma. Local physicians described the rate of cases as abnormal for a community of that size. Medical reports were requested from the provincial administration. Those reports were never formally delivered. So, workers dying of a disease directly caused by the material they were mining. Medical documentation requested and not provided, and then the town demolished after closure. The cemetery was the one thing they preserved, and even that was relocated. There's a logic to demolishing a town after an industrial closure. Sometimes it genuinely makes sense. But there's a different logic at work when the town being demolished is the same town where workers were dying of preventable diseases, and the medical oversight failed to produce documentation. Cassiar was erased, literally from the physical landscape. What you can't demolish, apparently, is the fact that people are still dying. Mesothelioma from Cassiar asbestos exposure has continued to appear in former residents for decades since the closure. The town is gone. The disease it left behind isn't. This one requires a moment to explain, because carbide isn't famous. It barely registers in historical records, which is precisely why it's here. Near the Mattawa River, in the late 1890s, a small workers' community formed around an experimental hydroelectric station built by a chemical company, Thomas Carbide Wilson's operation on the river. The station was technically innovative. The community around it was small, transient, working class, the kind of settlement that doesn't tend to generate much documentation. In 1898, the chief engineer was found dead inside the station. The case was registered as suicide. In the months that followed, the station was abandoned. The workers' community dissolved. Here's the thing. That community never appeared in the Canadian census as a permanent settlement. The people who lived there, who worked there, who presumably witnessed or at least knew about the engineer's death. They left no administrative trace, no formal record of their community's existence, not in the census, not in municipal records. It's not that Carbide was erased. It's that it was never properly written down in the first place, which, when you think about it, can be its own kind of erasure. Glenbogie was a rural community of Scottish immigrant descendants in Nova Scotia. It had roots going back generations. It had the kind of social coherence that comes from families staying in the same place for a long time. In 1917, a landowner was murdered. The killing happened in the context of a land dispossession conflict. A railway company was acquiring territory. Residents were resisting. Tensions had been building for years. The RCMP investigated. The case was closed without charges. In the 5 years following the murder, the community was entirely dispersed through expropriation proceedings connected to the same railway expansion that had generated the conflict in the first place. Today, the name Glenbogie doesn't appear on any provincial map. The community that existed there, that had existed there for generations, is not marked, not acknowledged, not commemorated. The murder came first, then the land was taken, then the name disappeared. That sequence is worth sitting with. Elsa was a silver and lead mining town in the Yukon that reached around 500 inhabitants at its height. Remote, cold, the kind of place where the isolation creates its own internal culture. In 1989, a Kaska indigenous worker died during a maintenance operation. His family requested an independent investigation. The RCMP closed the case as an accident. The town was abandoned in 1997. What doesn't appear in the historical record of Elsa, in any form, is the history of the Kaska people who had occupied that territory before the mine arrived. The community that was displaced to make room for the mining operation. The traditional land uses that ended. The people who were moved. The archive of Elsa is entirely the archive of the mine. The people who were there first are simply not in it. When the family of that worker asked for accountability in 1989, they were asking into a void, a system that had never treated the presence of their community as historically significant enough to record, and that was equally uninterested in treating their relative's death as legally significant enough to investigate independently. The mine closed, the town emptied, and the absence that was always there became the only thing left. Ukrainian immigrants founded Goldenrod in the early 20th century, carving out farmland on the Alberta prairie. These were people who had come a long way and built something lasting, a community with its own rhythms, its own church, its own sense of permanence. Then the Second World War happened. Under the War Measures Act, residents of Goldenrod were interned as enemy aliens. Ukrainian Canadians, people who had been farming that land for decades, were treated as a security threat. One man died in the Jasper internment camp. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure. When the surviving internees returned after the war, they found their land had been transferred to other owners through an administrative process. The RCMP never investigated that transfer as potential fraud, despite the fact that people were being dispossessed of property they had legally owned before the state imprisoned them. In 1947, provincial cartographic records were revised. The name Goldenrod was removed. It's that last detail that stays with you. Not just the internment, not just the dispossession, the revision of the maps. Someone in 1947 sat down and decided that Goldenrod didn't need to appear in the official record of Alberta anymore. That decision required intention. It required a signature somewhere. That signature has never been made public. This one isn't a town in the conventional sense, and that distinction matters enormously. After a residential school near Duck Lake closed in the 1970s, a group of indigenous families refused to disperse. They stayed. They formed a settlement. They established something that functioned as a community, even if the state never formally recognized it as one. Over the following decade, 3 men from that group died in separate circumstances. 2 of the bodies were found at distances that were difficult to reconcile with the official accounts of how they died. The RCMP closed all 3 cases, each one in under 90 days. In 1986, the settlement was removed by municipal order. No official record acknowledges that it existed as a permanent community. Think about the specific shape of that. A community that formed because its members refused to accept erasure, survivors of residential schools, people who had already experienced institutional violence, built something together. 3 of their members died under circumstances the RCMP closed quickly, and then the settlement itself was declared non-existent. The refusal was acknowledged in the demolition. The lives were not acknowledged at all. There is no name to give this entry. That's not a stylistic choice. There is genuinely no name on record. What exists is this. An RCMP patrol report from 1961 mentions in passing an irregular settlement of approximately 40 families, majority Anishinaabe, located northeast of Highway 11. A geographic reference. A head count. The kind of notation made when a patrol passes through somewhere and notes it exists. 2 years later, 1963, the same patrol sector produces a record describing the area as unoccupied, no history of permanent settlement. Between those 2 documents, nothing. No investigation, no resettlement process, no record of deaths, no explanation. Just a change in classification, from settlement of approximately 40 families to no history of permanent settlement, with no documentation of what happened in between. 40 families. Somewhere between 100 and 200 people. Gone from the record in 2 years. The federal and provincial archives available for public consultation contain nothing that explains the gap. Not a report. Not a transfer order. Not a health record. Not a name. This is the most disturbing entry in this entire countdown. Not because of what the documents say. Because of what someone decided they would never say. The 1961 report is proof that those people existed. The 1963 report is the decision that they wouldn't be allowed to keep existing, at least not in any way the state was willing to acknowledge. Whatever happened between those 2 dates, in those forests northeast of Highway 11, remains entirely outside the public record. And that absence, that precise, shaped, deliberate absence, is the clearest evidence we have that a decision was made. Canada has more than 1,000 ghost towns. For most of them, the story is economic. A resource depleted, a market collapsed, a company that left. But the 11 places in this countdown point towards something different. Not just towns that emptied. Towns that were allowed to empty, or helped to empty, at moments when someone, somewhere, had a reason to prefer the silence that comes after. The map of Canada is a political document. Every town that doesn't appear on it represents an active decision made by someone, at some point, that existence didn't deserve to be preserved in the record. What you're left with, after all of this, isn't outrage, exactly. It's something quieter and harder to shake. The realization that the most important pages in these archives are precisely the ones that are blank. Blank isn't neutral. Blank is a choice.